Hello, this is Nicewinder, and welcome to the NOWMAN show. I am here with Jack Bennett, who is a Los Angeles businessman working in the legal profession. Welcome back to the NOWMAN show.
Great to be here.
Now, the last time that you were here, you explained some of the details of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is supposedly a free trade agreement that has been negotiated with Canada, Mexico, and the Pacific Rim countries like New Zealand and Vietnam. The previous trade agreement was NAFTA.
Yes.
And that's the North America Free Trade Agreement that was negotiated during the Bush Senior administration, but then it wasn't signed into law until 1993 by the Bill Clinton administration. So the economist Robert Scott estimates that some 700,000 U.S. manufacturing jobs were lost as a result of the agreement. So please tell us what Americans should know about this new and expanded TPP trade agreement, and what is this agreement really actually about?
Well, keep in mind, there's no such thing as a free trade agreement. That's the worst name you could call this agreement. There's always a cost, and NAFTA, actually, the cost was put on the back of the American worker to the benefit of the corporations that put it together. Matter of fact, they had container ships full of money that they made on NAFTA. This new agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so-called free trade agreement, is NAFTA on steroids times 10.
So since the last visit, the text of that 600-page agreement has been released, and what have we learned from that?
Well, actually, it's a 6,000-page agreement encompassing 30 chapters. It is supposed to cover over 40% of the world's economy. It has been ratified by the 12 member countries in October, and in October also, as you recalled earlier, that the Trade Promotion Authority, the Fast Track, was completed and approved by Congress. And what that means is that the Congress, when they're ready to review it, they simply have a yes or no vote on it. They just rubber stamp it.
So that means that they technically don't have to have sessions convened in Congress, in the House or the Senate, to discuss this thing in any detail. They can just go in and have a vote, yay or nay, and that's it.
That's absolutely right. The agreement has been percolating since 2005. Now it's 2016. Finally, just a few weeks ago, the 6,000-page agreement has been placed online by the U.S. Trade Representative at ustr.gov. It's 6,000 pages of boring reading, but extremely complicated, sophisticated languaging, and that was another purpose, is to make the agreement so complicated in terms of line by line, page by page analysis of the entire global economy going forward for the next 100 years, that most folks actually, after the first few hundred pages, you actually fall asleep or become bored or distracted, and that was intently done. And there's no one actually able to determine whether the statements made in that 6,000-page agreement will come to fruition. There's a lot of statements made. For example, one of the biggest statements is that the agreement will, and I quote, level the playing field for American workers and American businessmen. But the problem with that statement, who is making that determination that it will level the playing field? Certainly not the American workers, not the American unions. Corporations are making that definition.
So the people that initially had access to it in the first place were like attorneys, right? Representing corporations?
Dozens and dozens of what I refer to as specialized corporate attorneys refining what would be specifically in the best interests of the super corporations, internationally speaking. What I mean by super corporations, no real allegiance to any specific country or government. Their allegiance is to making as much money per second anywhere on the planet that is necessary to effectuate their product and service.
Haven't there been lawsuits that have been made based on different arrangements already within the existing trade agreements?
Well, there's actually 20 trade agreements in existence with the United States today. This is another pylon, but this one is quite different. This is delving deeper into intellectual properties, into pharmaceutical rules, into corporate tribunals. And for example, the intellectual property is very interesting. As we all know, the super economy of the future is intellectual property. You create a program and you want the super rights worldwide. Well, guess what? There's a lot of other folks out there in other parts of the world that may come up with a similar program, but if you're the first one with that program, you could actually have a rule that your program trumps that country's innovation, and you will monopolize that, as Google attempted in China.
So that's a portion that is kind of hidden in those 6,000 pages.
It's embedded
too,
and such as the super pharmaceutical corporate interest. For example, specifically, if there is a medicine or a drug created here in the United States, what the United States super pharmaceutical companies want to do is actually monopolize it. So if there is a cheaper generic drug that can be made in another country, well, that country will be banned from making that. So that means higher prices for a longer period of time.
So would that have any impact on other developments? For
It'll have
instance, single payer or something like that being implemented?
It'll have an impact on everything we do, and the cost will be higher for a longer period of time. And so there's a lot of hidden things. In other words, we're looking at a 6,000-page contract. Could you imagine buying a home and the realtor just puts a 30-page contract and just tells you either sign it or we're not buying it? You should be instrumental in every sentence, every paragraph, every page of your agreement. You know more about your Verizon phone bill contract than this contract that will actually govern how we work, live for the next 100, 200 years in North America. It is astounding, the lack of understanding, and it was intently made for that. We cannot change it, we cannot confirm it, we could only look at it and question it, but we can't modify it. And remember, the United States Constitution specifically stated that Congress shall have the power to negotiate commerce between the United States and foreign countries. The corporations have obliterated that and many other parts of the Constitution. They have completely hijacked the ability to produce products and services in terms of the control of commerce, instead of Congress doing that. It is shocking that is happening.
So it's actually stepping on the U.S. Constitution as it was written.
In many places, in many places.
Wow.
And what is happening now with the Obama administration is they're making this as their trophy agreement, that this is going to be their legacy. And that is the wrong thing to do. What you should do is determine exactly how this will affect the American worker, the American economy, the American ability to protect its national interest. These super corporations have absolutely no loyalty, no patriotism to any of what the American institutions have been put together for. They are actually just running amok and running out of here after they sucked out for 100 years or more of all the institutions, all the infrastructure from the United States of America.
So, wow, that all being said, I mean, that's, you know, since the last time you came here, there have obviously been a lot of updates, and now we should have some people seriously taking a look at more of the content as you have. So what is the timetable for the Senate and the House to vote on this agreement now? Where is that? Is that delayed until the next president comes into a...
It's delayed in limbo. It's actually floating. It's actually, right now, the entire content, the entire text is available for viewing, and most people are not looking at it, number one. Number two, as I said, you can't change it, you can't modify it. But what is very interesting, it's in the last pages of the newspapers, if you could find it, number one. Additionally, it's mentioned very lightly by the presidential contenders of both parties. What has to happen specifically, it must be formally submitted to Congress, and then within 90 legislative days, they must decide whether they like it or not. Just a red light or a green light with no specific interaction for modification. There are some interesting, what appears to be from the surface, good parts with good names and good fronts. But if you dig down deeper, it is an atrocious agreement that should actually be set aside and reworked with all interested parties in it.
So what can people like you and I and the viewers do now?
Absolutely classic, contact your representatives and say, absolutely do not pass this or you're out of there. The corporations are hoping that there's a lack of attention and focus and in-depth analysis. They're banking on it. They're banking it in the tunes of billions of dollars, as I said, that they could make either on a daily basis. It's incredible how much money they could make.
Thank you. We'll post this script on the NOWMAN Show Facebook page. Thank you, Jack
You're welcome.
Bennett, for being on the NOWMAN Show. This is Nice Wander. Hello, this is Nice Wander of the NOWMAN Show, and I'm here at Occidental College with Professor Richard Wolff of New School University in Manhattan. Thank you for being on the NOWMAN Show, Professor.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I have a couple questions for you. First of all, we just heard a great talk called Imagining Alternatives and Progressive Economics and Social Movements. First of all, what is the history of socialism in the United States?
Well, the history of socialism in this country is not so different from the history elsewhere. Basically, since capitalism arose as a system and it came to the United States with the colonists who took over this country from the Native Americans, capitalism has been the way that the system organized itself, employers and employees. And like all systems, capitalism in the United States and elsewhere has had the people who love it and the people who don't, the people who think it's a great achievement and the people who think we can and should do better. The folks who think we can and should do better, over time, adopted a name for themselves, and the name was socialists. Their idea was capitalism is a system set up for a minority of people, the few who own the factories, the offices, the stores, who are in a position to decide what gets produced and what gets done with the profits. And they run the system to benefit themselves. And the critics said, yeah, but that's the problem. The system benefits you because you run it, but we, who are the majority, and in whose name a revolution in America against Britain was run, we are being left out. So we want the whole society to benefit, not just you, and so they took the name socialists. They did it in Europe, they did it here. And so the irony of it is that socialism is capitalism's shadow. You can't get rid of your shadow, and capitalism can never get rid of socialism, because socialism is the name for the people who are critics. And you can imagine that the system will one day be so wonderful that it will have no critics. But that's never happened in the history of the human race, and it's really a long shot this time. So socialists have been up and down. They've been big with lots of people thinking it. Other times they've been small. What you can say is the idea that you could get beyond it, that you could live in a capitalism that had no socialism, that's we've never seen. And the irony of ironies is that now, after a Cold War period since Second World War, when it was almost taboo to say socialism, here it comes once again, proving itself always there as it comes roaring back, first in the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, and now in the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, as if to tell the world, I told you so, socialism isn't going away, you haven't erased it, because it's the shadow, it's the criticism. And eventually, my guess is that the critics will so outnumber the defenders that the system will dissolve. Because I think that's what happened in the Soviet Union in 1989, that the critics were so numerous, were so determined, that it just fell apart. It was a dissolution, and the notion that it can only happen there and can't happen here is the worst kind of wishful thinking.
And we have, as you mentioned, capitalists dominating the system, essentially. So it's not the ism, it's the people behind it dominating the system. So how do capitalists who've been set in their ways now, we're not just talking about a couple generations, we're talking, 200 some years. How would capitalists evolve into this new system?
Well, my guess is they wouldn't evolve. That is, some would. Some would find this perfectly reasonable. I actually know of quite a few cases in the United States over the last 20 years when capitalists who built up a very successful business came to the end of their lives, and their children weren't interested in carrying on this business. So they didn't know what to do. They could close the business, but they didn't want to do that because it's a lifetime's work. They built up this business, they have their employees, they care about them, they're decent people. So they didn't want to close the business, and they didn't want to sell it to some faceless monster corporation because who knows what they will do with the business and the property. So they didn't know what to do, and then we came along and we said, there is another solution. You could sell it to the workers, convert it into a collective activity of these working people. It's a new way of doing business, but it keeps their jobs, it keeps their communities. It is an exciting new way to live your life, your work life. Why don't you give it a shot? And I think that you'll be surprised that there is a significant number of capitalists who will find their way to this, not as something imposed on them, but something that they choose. But I see your point. There will be capitalists who hate it, who want to block it, who want to stop it. But let me go back to the example of the Soviet Union. Most people agree that in the decades before the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had a powerful central government with an elaborate secret police, with an elaborate system of controlling the population. Most Americans thought it was a dictatorship of one kind or another. They were tough. They could control the opposition. Yeah, and then they couldn't. Then despite all of their apparatus and all their secret police, the existing regime fell apart. The Soviet Union came to an end. I understand that there are powerful forces in the capitalist sector, in the government, that would want to stop this. But the fact that they have a lot of resources and the fact that they want to stop it is no more a guarantee that they'll be able to do that than it proved to be for the people who ran the Soviet Union. So I think we ought to take our hats off for a minute and understand every economic system in the history of the world has been born, has developed, and then has passed away. Capitalism was born in England in the 18th century, 17th century, has spread all over the world, changed in the process. It's now everywhere, but the question is it now passing away? The notion that capitalism, unlike any other system, will live forever and not pass away, I think the burden of that, proof of that, is on the people who believe it, not those of us who find it unbelievable.
Well, you mentioned in your talk about even Plato and Aristotle that did not like markets, and markets is what capitalism is really all about, correct?
I've been teaching a course. I taught it at Yale, I taught it at the University of Massachusetts, I've taught it in New York. It's called The History of Economics Thought. It's one of the standard courses that students in economics are required to take, so they get a sense of how their discipline developed. And I always begin the course by assigning readings from Plato and Aristotle, just to show, A, that they had very good questions they asked about economics, good answers that they gave, and I must admit I want them to see that both Plato and Aristotle thought markets were a terrible institution because they set everybody against everybody else. Everybody is always trying to give as little as possible to get in exchange as much as possible. This puts you in an adversarial, ugly relationship with everybody. How are you going to have friendships? How are you going to have love relationships when they're always undercut and contradicted by the economic way you do your transactions that make your life better? And another thing both Plato and Aristotle hated was that markets tend to favor those who have money. I mean, that's what a market is. The more money you have, the more you get. If there's scarce items, the one with more money offers to pay more, which the one with less can't afford. So what markets do is they pander to the rich. And in the minds of Plato and Aristotle, this is not a good arrangement for social cohesion, for community solidarity, because this favoritism will develop a polarity between rich and poor, and that is dynamite dangerous for a community to allow that to go on. And boy, do we live in a capitalism today which has let that process go on farther than has been done for a long time. And it's equally scary to people now on all sides of the political divide, because there's this deep sense that this level of inequality is social dynamite.
And with Oxfam statistics, 62 billionaires on the planet have as much wealth as half the lower half of the population. So, Professor Wolff, thank you so much for being on the NOWMAN show. Give us some information of where people can learn more about what you're doing.
Yeah, if you like the materials that we do, the radio program Economic Update that we do, then please visit our websites. They're open 24/7, no charge whatsoever. The two of them are rdwolff with 2fs.com, that's me, and the other one is called Democracy at Work, all one word, democracyatwork.info, I-N-F-O.
Fantastic. Professor Wolff, thank you very much for being on the NOWMAN show.
Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. This is Nice Wonder. Until next time.
In 2016, I can do something I haven't been able to do for the last 5 years that I've been running around the country giving talks. In the past, I have to be careful that the things I go through don't get you down too much. I do have to remind you, as some of you may remember if you've heard me before, that I'm just the messenger describing what's going on. And that if you don't like what's going on, please remember I'm just the messenger. I didn't cause any of this stuff. And it's important not to get angry at the messenger, even if you don't like the message. But I don't have to do that, because the wind has changed. I'm going to try to explain and put into a context how profound that change is and what I think it implies for all of us, every single person in this room and far beyond. So let's begin with the collapse of Eastern Europe's socialist experiment, 1989, 1990, then. If you recall, that amazing disintegration came for most of the security services around the world, and certainly for ours in this country, as a complete and utter shock and surprise. Those geniuses hadn't seen it coming. That's something you should keep in mind. These kinds of collapses take a long time to build up, and then they happen suddenly, but it isn't sudden at all. It's something that could have and should have been seen, and when you go back, you can pretty well put it together. And if it happened in the Soviet Union, well then, ... I'm going to come back to that thing. What happened in the Soviet Union was the disintegration of one particular kind of creation of something called socialism. It was 150 years old, the movement of socialism, which in the Russian Revolution in 1917, the folks there, Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, and the others, tried to put into effect. They did pretty well what it was that socialists thought they ought to do. What was it? They basically understood socialism in a way that is now rapidly changing. Here's what they thought. Capitalism, in their view, was a society in which the enterprises, the factories, the stores, the offices, were owned and operated by individual private citizens. They were free enterprises, if you like, or private enterprises. And the way they interacted with one another, buying and selling, and the way they interacted with the public was by means of markets. They sold stuff in exchange for money. So the way we say that in economics is it was private ownership of the means of production and markets as the way of distributing the goods and services. Well, then what was socialism if that was capitalism? Well, the answer was clear. You take the enterprises away from the private owners, and the government takes them over, more or less. And you stop distributing goods and services by means of exchange, buying and selling, markets, and instead you use government planning. You distribute by a plan rather than a market. Capitalism, private enterprise and markets; socialism, public enterprise and planning. So when the Soviets made their revolution, 1917, they basically decided, since they couldn't dare take all the private enterprises away from the private owners, it would have meant that the revolution was over 4 or 5 minutes after it would have begun. Why? Because the vast majority of Russian people in that time were farmers, peasants. They desperately wanted that land, and the only way that revolution could happen and survive is if it gave the people the land, which it did. Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin agreed we're going to distribute the land to the peasant. Therefore, the truth of it is that the Soviet Union never abolished private property. On the contrary, the most important property it had, it gave to private owners. That's what the revolution did, and that's why the peasants supported it. Without that, the Soviets would never have survived the Civil War, the invasion by the West, and so on. But the Soviet Union did transfer industry from private to public hands. Not agriculture, which is where most people work, but industry. And they also developed a planning mechanism to distribute goods. They produced the socialism they understood was their task as socialist revolutionaries. 1917, with the rest of Eastern Europe coming after World War II, as you all know. Let's take a look for a few minutes at what that socialism achieved and what went wrong, because it'll help me situate for you what is happening now.